So today we'll be talking about the role of business in global security and the geopolitical risk that companies must increasingly take into account given the state of the world today. I'm delighted to be joined by a stellar panel today with a lot of experience in this area. So on the far side, we have Manisha Singh, the founder and principal of Sunstone Strategy Group and former Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. We have Ben Smith, the board member, senior partner, and practice leader for communications, media, and technology at Kearney. And Isaac Stonefish, founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, and coincidentally an alumnus of the magazine that I now write for. So really excited for this conversation. So I'd like to start by posing a question to all three of you. We're obviously living in a time of great geopolitical turmoil, uncertainty, multiple conflicts around the globe, escalating great power competition. When you look out in your current roles, when you look out across the global landscape, what stands out to you as kind of the greatest risk that companies are thinking about and need to be thinking about right now? We can start with Ben.
I mean, I think for most executives, we've spent our entire lives in a fairly stable environment. There's not a lot of us left in the world who were working, sort of pre-87. So I think the biggest risk is the constant instability. As a CEO, you're facing unpredictable interest rates and inflation that looks like the 70s. You're facing, constant surprise geopolitical moves like we're seeing in the Middle East, which is very similar to the 73 issue. And then there's the big one, which is the China threat. And if you're a head of supply chain, head of R&D, head of ops CEO, most of your life, the answer has always been go to China, whether it's from a market perspective or from a production perspective. And it's pretty difficult for when the entire, overnight, that opportunity sort of disappears, and there's no other real easy option to duplicate that effort. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about the invasion of Taiwan, because I think all bets are off if it happens. My wife's Netflix account probably won't work a month later, and that'll be that's going to get pretty serious. But there's a lot of things short of that in the China conflict in terms of coercion, their influence on a set of other nations, infiltration, all the way down to the minor stuff of, the fact that my daughter still uses TikTok and that the Chinese stole my Office of Personnel file. So, there's a lot of things between well short of an armed conflict that companies have to worry about.
Right.
So I'll focus very firmly on China, in part because that's what we do, and in part because I think that's the most important and most misunderstood part of this game. We've been very heartened to see businesses over the last several years start to remove their hands from their eyes and have a much more concrete sense about the risks posed by China and the Chinese Communist Party, and actually starting to quantify and measure those risks in their management decisions. I think very concretely, what has changed is actually far less any sort of US regulatory change, any sort of movement towards Taiwan, anything in the US political environment, but really it's been domestic changes in China where Chairman Xi is taking the economy on a very, very hard left turn towards the opposite of privatization, the opposite of innovation, moving to a much more command economy. And the businesses that we work with, a lot of them have started to move, fortunately or unfortunately, not because of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, not because of semiconductor restrictions, but because of the disappearance of Jack Ma, formerly the wealthiest man in China. The fact that a Chinese CEO could tweet a very oblique poetic reference to book burning, I think about 2,000 years ago, and see his stock price go down 4% immediately because people thought that was a very, very hooded critique of Xi Jinping. The fact that Bao Fan, the best known Chinese tech banker, has disappeared. And there's dozens and dozens of other examples of that. So I think when we sit back and have the US global risk or any sort of risk conversation, a lot of the risks don't have that much to do with changes in the US, the very real worries about US national security vis-a-vis China, but what Beijing and what the Communist Party of China has been doing over the last several years to close off from the world.
I think several decades ago, you could do some basic checks on where your goods were coming from. We all remember the days when US retailers found out that their clothes or shoes were being manufactured in factories through forced labor with no safety standards. And the US consumer became aware of this and decided, that's not how I want to buy my shoes, my clothes, goods, and where they're being manufactured. Now it's an automatic part of supply chain issues in a company to think about where are these goods being sourced. And I think we have to continue to go even a little deeper. We know when it comes to China, Xinjiang and the forced labor, the Uyghur concentration camps where people are being forced to make goods, that's a high profile, very newsworthy item that I think most people are aware of. But let's go a little deeper. Where, if you are sourcing goods in any part of the world, in the United States, I think CEOs and heads of companies have to dig a little deeper and find out, where are these goods coming from? What is the political risk? What are the geopolitics of any particular government at any particular time? Is there a chance that my factory, my manufacturing base can be expropriated by a government in South America? So I think I would answer that question by saying, CEOs today, I think that they are on the right track in evaluating geopolitical risk, supply chain issues very carefully, but we need to continue to dig a little deeper. And that's the best way for a company to actually anticipate and manage risk, which can be hugely damaging to one's business.
Right. So Manisha, I'm going to put you right back on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
You've been on both sides of this, having been in government fairly recently, and you've seen both sides of this over the last few years. So when you were in government, when you were at state, how did you approach conversations with the private sector, and do you see more alignment now between kind of the private and public when it comes to a lot of these issues?
Absolutely. Well, Rishi, that's a great question. And as the Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, working under the great Keith Kroc when he was Undersecretary, I'll put that plug in there. I think that it was very important for us to meet with companies regularly, understand their concerns. And the goal of the E-line, the economic line generally, was to help promote American companies and American business overseas. And vice versa, we expected American companies to be good corporate citizens. In fact, every year the State Department gives out awards. They're called the ACE Awards, awards for corporate social responsibility in different categories. When I was at the State Department, one of the new awards in corporate responsibility that I inaugurated was for women's economic empowerment. How companies were enabling women to become full participants in the labor force, because we know that when women participate in the economy fully, the GDPs of nations rise. The World Bank, the IMF, have done studies that show this. So I think it was a true partnership where we told American companies, we're going to help you. We're going to do everything we can to make you competitive, to help your workers succeed in the global market. In return, we expect you to have the highest standards for labor environment, to understand the communities in which you're operating. So I would characterize it as a true partnership with the private sector.
Ben, in the context of the intersection of kind of business and geopolitics, a lot of the conversation revolves around supply chains, how supply chains are reorienting, particularly in the technology sector. So how are business leaders in this space thinking about supply chains differently to how they were, say, 4 or 5 years ago even?
There's certainly a desire to regionalize the supply chains. This is sort of going to drive inherent efficiency in the global economy because specialization by country on different pieces of the supply chain is part of what drives efficiency. But there is a move, and that's not just from the US, but also from Western Europe, to regionalize the supply chain, both from a risk perspective of getting the goods, as well as from a IP protection perspective. In the tech world specifically, for the past 50 years, we've operated with, there ended up being 2 or 3 winners at every layer of their stack, whether it was memory, drives, processors, the database stack, all the way up. And it drives enormous efficiency because whatever layer you're going to innovate at, the layer below, there's going to be industry leaders. Well, now we're evolving into a world where you have 2 stacks. You have the Chinese stack and you have the freedom stack. And there's a lot of countries and companies who sit in between who have to make choices. It's very inefficient to operate on both. So you have a regionalization of supply chain. You have a bunch of choices in terms of where you operate in the technology stack. And a lot of it is difficult because there's no easy option. I mean, the big hardware tech companies, a lot of them already went to Vietnam. There's not a lot of room left. And it's frankly not, if you have hard IP, that's not exactly a great place to protect it regardless. So, it's not as matter of like, I just want to move my component factory from one place to the other. There's a whole ecosystem around it, the talent pool, the inbound part manufacturers, et cetera. So there was a lot of effort from the leading companies to encourage their supply base to establish these new ecosystems. Now, some of that doesn't turn out the way they expect. They think they're moving into Mexico, but they're moving it into a Chinese facility in Mexico, and they didn't realize that. Right. Chinese-owned land, Chinese industrial park, Chinese factory. They thought they were moving it, but all they did was move it physically and not actually change the risk. So a lot of changes happening.
Right. So just a quick follow-up. Like a lot of the original incentive for moving to China was the cost, the kind of cheap labor, and now it seems like it's very expensive to sort of cut out China or like circle supply chains around outside of China. Is that just a cost that companies are willing to bear, or how are they thinking about it?
I mean, like any other ecosystem, you may move for labor. Once it builds up, they extract the value. So it's not the cheapest place to be today, not even close. There are plenty of other countries that are cheaper. The problem is to rebuild that ecosystem costs a lot of capital, and it costs time. And when you're building a consumer electronic, everything in there that adds 5 cents to a part, it adds up, and you've got a problem. And the next thing you know, Timu's spelling some fake online that was cheaper than your stuff. So these companies are having to make choices. A lot of them are moving a portion in the beginning because then they can sort of blend the margin overall. So they've hedged the risk, but they 80% there, 20% somewhere else, so they can blend the margin. But over time, governments have to step in to help do that. Now, obviously, the CHIPS Act helped some of that, but it's not cheap to pick up a factory who makes a thermostat that all of us use and move it to a different part of the world.
So Isaac, your company Strategy Risk focuses specifically on China, and as we've heard, that is very much the elephant in the room. So when you look at the kind of spectrum of China risk specifically, what stands out to you as the biggest challenge, and how are businesses reevaluating their relationship to China? We hear about it a lot. I guess my question is, what are they actually doing? What's actually happening?
That's a great question. So we see this at Strategy Risks as having 3 main components. You could say actual business risk, which is mostly what people talk about. Hey, I can't get this part. Hey, I want to buy some graphite from a Chinese factory, but we're unable to do so because of unofficial embargo. Or, hey, I'm a European company and my head of state just met with the Dalai Lama or said something nice about Taiwan, and suddenly I'm just closed out. Then you have the risks on the US side, which I would argue are much more PR risks and regulatory risks. There's a raft of new laws and regulations coming out from US government arms that seek to restrict the ability of American companies to do business in China, and especially with the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a dirty little secret about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is, I would argue, far and away the most toothy and most effective way that US Congress has come up with to reduce business exposure to China. It wasn't done for human rights reasons. It was nominally done for human rights reasons. It was done to increase the cost for American companies to invest in a country that many in the US government are really worried about being on the other side of a war with. And so understanding very concretely these regulatory risks and how to follow not just the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, but in a way that really adheres to business values. So I'm going to talk very briefly and then we'll cut me off. But so much of how business has been done with China has put Chinese citizens in danger. And we think it's really important to make sure that big American businesses that have large China operations start hiving them off from the rest of the operation. And this really goes against a lot of efficient management hypotheses, but you can't ask your Chinese partner to assess forced labor in a supply chain or PLA exposure or links with the Ministry of State Security because you're going to get them in trouble. They know it, they get it, but they're not going to give you the information that you need. So we work with a lot of companies that understand the need to start hiving these things off and to start thinking about these things in really a new way.
So Manisha, can you speak a little bit to the role that the U.S. allies and partners have in this conversation? Like how do companies and also on the government side, how do you think about kind of building this a network of sorts that kind of blunts some of these risks or gives some sort of mitigation apparatus?
Absolutely, Rishi. Well, when I was at the State Department working with Keith and Meng and the great team there, we actually thought through this. We thought about how can we talk to our allies and partners about the risks posed by China, certainly in the technology space. And, I traveled around to capitals all over the world, and I remember having conversations in European capitals, and many of them were not convinced. We were specifically talking about Huawei technology, and we said, if you engage Huawei in your government system, certainly that information is compromised. And I had conversations specifically with our Five Eyes partners where we share the greatest amount of US intelligence. And they were skeptical. They sort of said, well, we can manage it. We'll sort of cordon it off. And the response that we gave was, you don't know. When you talk about cordoning it off or creating a firewall, you don't know what is being extracted by the Chinese government through Huawei technology. But over the years, over the months that we had these conversations, and certainly over the last couple of years, I think we've seen an evolution. At some point, the UK intelligence services came out with their own conclusion. They informed their government broadly. We think that the Americans are right, that our information is being compromised when we have Huawei or ZTE in our government systems. And so that theme eventually began to resonate more when they found out themselves that our intelligence and therefore our sovereignty is being fully compromised. And I think now, several years later, they have a much better understanding of what we were saying at the time. And I think, having still conversations with my former colleagues at the State Department, they even tell us that that conversation is easier to have now because there's a real understanding of what is being compromised, not just when it comes to China, but authoritarian regimes all over the world. And so our partners are much more willing to cooperate with us on finding, trusted vendors, the trusted networks, the global economic security strategy, which we started at the State Department, and certainly with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hamas's invasion of Israel, bombing of Israel. So many of these geopolitical events have showed our allies and partners that we in the free world really need to be on the same page if we're going to take down authoritarian regimes. It can't just be the United States acting alone.
Right. So I want to ask a follow-up, kind of maybe a little bit of a devil's advocate question to you, and I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts as well. But Ben mentioned the kind of regionalization of these supply chains, and every country, like the US and EU, both have CHIPS Acts. India is building up its own semiconductor ecosystem, and countries around the world are trying to be self-sufficient. How do you manage that in such a way that it prevents kind of veering into protectionism or kind of a subsidy race to the bottom or oversupply in the market? There's a lot of issues and criticisms with that approach. So how do you think about striking that balance?
I think that's an excellent question. And, there is a balance, certainly is necessary. Most countries are producing their, in terms of technology and the evolution of intelligence gathering mechanisms, they're producing their own. I think that we can all produce our own technology and use it in our government systems while still trusting our allies and partners. I don't think it needs to be the case that the United States government has to do everything alone. And I think the answer to your question is we do have that trusted ally and partner network. We have treaties with countries around the world. We share the burden of global security. And so even though every country wants to be independent in its technology and intelligence, we can have relationships with trusted allies through open communication. And I certainly had those conversations with my counterparts around the world. How do we work together on this while not endangering our own individual national security? You're right, it's a tough balance, but I think we can find it.
I mean, you mentioned the semiconductor capacity issue specifically. If everybody starts pouring money into capacity, the Simplot family who funded Micron a long time ago, they talked about it's the same thing. Potatoes and chips are the same thing because they go through cycles, right? And we are pumping an enormous amount of capital into the semiconductor business around the world. And India, frankly, hasn't made a move yet. And they have their own issues as to why that has happened. But there's an enormous amount of capital going into it. And it's a long-term, big piece of capital you deploy. It's not something you turn on and turn off. And I have no doubt we're going to have a lot of cheap chips in about 10 years, which I guess the AI wave will suck up. But this issue of how do you coordinate across the free world to make sure you don't duplicate and still have trust that when something happens, that your partners are going to let you have access to it. That we're all going to cooperate. And that really applies to the defense industrial base. Whether it's Australia, who's out there all alone, or it is Western Europe, we need to know that when something happens, that the Oscar freedom, the Oscar democracy is going to be there to support each other. Otherwise, you're going to end up with everybody duplicating everything. And that just drives overall efficiency of the economy and GDP down. That's just fundamentally bad. I mean, if you end up with, everybody, the French used to do this, everybody wanting their own PC company, everybody wanting their own disk drive company, et cetera. That just doesn't work.
Isaac, anything to add?
Just that you don't, and things are going to get a lot more inefficient, and companies are already being forced to choose sides and to hive off and to focus differently, and we just see that trend continuing.
Right. So, Manisha, I guess what would you say is we talked earlier about sort of the government and private sector working together, academia as well. What would you say, are there any major misconceptions or areas of disconnect that one side has about the other, and what's the best way to kind of close those gaps that if they exist?
Well, I think probably one of the gaps is sometimes the private sector thinks that it's the government's job to solve every problem. There's a lot that we can do. We can provide good policy. We can provide avenues for companies to succeed. But at the end of the day, a business has to succeed on its merits. And so, government is a resource in providing the right sort of forum, the right sort of, leveling the playing field for our companies where it's not a fair game around the world. But I think companies also have to realize that government is not going to solve every single problem for them. Sometimes, companies have to look at market dynamics, have to figure out how to compete fairly.
Ben, we're seeing two violent conflicts right now in countries that have vibrant tech ecosystems of their own in Ukraine and Israel. And we've seen, particularly in Ukraine, a lot of involvement from the private sector in kind of protecting cyberspace and even in the defense sector. So how have those kind of geopolitical shocks, of course, China is an ongoing issue, but the kind of geopolitical shockwaves, how's that impacted industry? And yes.
Well, I think, when you got into the 90s, a lot of energy in the world went into the commercial sector, went into innovation in the commercial sector. I mean, a lot of Silicon Valley, if you go back to my younger days, it was people who left the defense industry to create a lot of these companies.
Yeah.
Whether it's from a venture perspective or a corporate perspective, there is a lot of movement back the other way of recognizing that the defense industrial base, the defense technology, is something that's going to be invested in a big way. I think that you'll see a shift back and a cultural shift, especially in Silicon Valley, of maybe that sort of goodness and light to actually do those kind of innovations versus a period of 20 years where it was seen to be evil, to be working on those kind of issues.
So Isaac, one thing I do want to ask you about is in the coming days, we're most likely going to see President Biden and President Xi meet in San Francisco at APEC. So how likely is any sort of thaw in the US-China relationship right now? And were that to happen, how would that change the calculus for companies that have gotten used to the geopolitical environment we've been in for more than a year now?
It's a great question. It's an intensely political one, so I'll answer it in a political way. So I would say the three possible scenarios, on which US and China relations improve. One is a war over Iran that the US and China somehow find a way to be on the same side of. Another is North Korea collapsing, and again, the US and China finding a way to partner on that. The third is a lot of progressive weight around climate change that somehow finally convinces the rest of the country that climate change is the reason to forestall a lot of other national interests. And the fourth, speaking frankly, is either massive political uncertainty in the United States. Say Trump loses in November 2024, says he wins, there's policy paralysis, Beijing goes in and seizes that opportunity to take Taiwan, the US doesn't act quickly enough, or frankly, Trump wins and, for better or worse, he is still the most unpredictable candidate that we have. And so I would say it's more likely that Trump could improve ties between the United States and China than any other major candidate, in large part because we don't actually know what he would do.
That was a good political answer. I'll give you another political answer. It blows my mind that Silicon Valley executives and a number of execs around this world are paying $250,000 to meet with that guy when he's in the Bay Area. I mean, those people are going to get named and shamed. There was a fee to go meet with this guy. Right. And it's being passed around that, if you're in the Valley, you get these invites to pay to meet with the other side. That's just nuts.
And in the absence of said thaw in relations, are there still any areas where the US and China can work together, either private or public?
So let me also just very quickly distinguish China and the Chinese Communist Party. So China and the party are radically different entities. It'd be lovely to have more engagement with Chinese people, with Chinese companies. Unfortunately, there's so much state control. So every time there's a sister city relationship, that's governed by the United Front, which we'll get into when we don't have 45 seconds. So US and China on a government level, no, I don't think so. I think it's going to keep going down. I think there's going to be a lot more realism in the United States vis-a-vis China. But the fun thing about predictions is if I'm right, remember it, and if I'm wrong, I never said it. So we can keep that idea alive.
All right, that's a good note to almost end on, but I'd just like to throw it open to each of you one last time. Like any thoughts you want the audience to leave this conversation with? What's the one takeaway that everyone should have? We can start with Manisha.
Well, I think my one takeaway would be, what I said before about companies and American entities being responsible actors in the world. American brands are sometimes the biggest introduction of America to places in the world that don't have a lot of exposure. It'll be interesting to see what happens if North Korea ever collapses, North Korea ever opens up, and how they respond to American culture, American brands. We can go back to the Soviet Union where the goodwill item was Levi's jeans. And so, I would urge everybody to remember that you as Americans, your companies, your entities really are diplomacy. You're the face of America to the world. The average citizen, in the Middle East and Southeast Asia doesn't get to meet with high-ranking government officials, even any government officials, but they will meet with you. You'll be in a store and they'll remember, there was this American man or American woman that came through and he or she was so nice. So that's my one takeaway, is that government has a lot of power, but we as the people are the true entities that shape the hearts and minds around the world of what America really is.
We can go down the row.
So I think that Crack Institute does a phenomenal job of facilitating these conversations and actually pushing the debate in the right direction. I'll end on two notes. One is, broadly speaking, the US government does not want you to invest in China. Some of them have an understanding of the economic fundamentals and the reason why that's happening. Some of them don't. But if it were up to them and they could wave a economically absurd magic wand and cut off trade ties, I think a lot of them would vote for that. So just understand that when you're talking to government officials, especially those in Congress and Senate, that they don't want to solve your problems in China unless the solution is to reduce your China exposure. The second thing I'll say is that there's a huge amount of information out there that explains the way that businesses are entangled with the Communist Party. And this was good behavior. This is what we were all supposed to do until roughly 2016, 2018. But understand that you can find that information. You can take concrete steps to fix it.
Ben, last word.
I think that a lot of boards and executives that I talk to have the feeling of this too shall pass. And we're probably at the beginning of a 20-year difficult cycle, not a 2-year cycle when it comes to this issue. And I do think from a political perspective and the political pressure on both sides, frankly, no matter which, even the populists are moving this way, there is going to be a push. And it's not just in the US. Western Europe is doing the same thing now.
All right. Well, thank you all for a great discussion. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did and we did. And thank you to Keith Kroc and Michelle and the Kroc Institute for facilitating this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.